Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Sean Egan. I am the Director of COVID Workplace Safety for the state of Michigan, as well as the Deputy Director for Labor here in the state of Michigan. And I'm just here today to welcome you to this riveting discussion about accommodating employees during COVID-19. You have a great panel today that will help with a lot of the questions that we are facing and having across the state. And I will just quickly give you an update on things that we're doing to protect workplace safety in Michigan. One of the first things I always like to do is to remind everybody how the virus spreads. We know that it comes from large respiratory droplets and aerosols that we create when we talk, sneeze, cough, shout, and you name it. And that's one of the reasons that we are seeing so much about wearing face coverings and social distancing and good hand hygiene. Now, I know that part of the discussion today will be about face coverings. We do know that there are people in Michigan that are medically unable to tolerate those types of face coverings, and we'll have a discussion, or you'll have a discussion about things that you can do in the alternative for those folks. We are getting a lot of complaints in MIOSHA. The Michigan Occupational Safety and Health Administration is the primary agency that enforces workplace safety in the state of Michigan. I can assure you that our folks there are working very hard and diligently to respond to complaints and inquiries across the state, including those employees that may need some type of reasonable accommodation to make sure that they can continue to participate in our economy. Complaints are up substantially over the last several months, and our folks are doing a great job of getting out in the field. We also have a wonderful website that you can use as a resource. It's michigan.gov/COVID workplace safety. We have a lot of great tools there, including guidelines for every industry that's been named in an executive order. We have general industry guidelines for those industries that have not been named in an executive order. And you should take a look at those to make sure that you understand what your workplace should be doing if you're an employer, or what your employer should be doing if you're a worker. There are also flyers, posters, fact sheets, social media tools, videos, and other things there. We do have most of the flyers and posters available in alternative languages as well. MIOSHA early in this crisis set up a COVID-specific hotline as well, and that is 855-SAFE-C19. That's 855-SAFE-C19. This is a great resource for anybody that has questions about their workplace, whether you're an employer or an employee, to call in related to COVID and just kind of try to work through what it is that needs to be happening within your workplace. So don't forget, these resources are available to you, and make sure you check them out. We're updating there constantly, and you check back often to make sure you have the most relevant data. Today, I'm very pleased and happy to introduce a good friend, Brian Calley, the former Lieutenant Governor of Michigan, as well as a state rep and senator. You name it, he's done it. He's also the president of the Small Business Association of Michigan, and I can tell you firsthand that Brian has been a great resource for us to make sure that we are giving messages as well as receiving messages into state government and trying to do the things that we can do to support our economy. So very pleased to introduce Brian, and I wish you all a great discussion and look forward to hearing all of these great answers.
Very good. Well, thank you, Sean. Thanks for the very kind introduction, and thank you to everyone who is on now participating. I see that we've got hundreds who have joined this conversation, and it's a very important one. We hope that it will be one that provides a lot of value and insight, and not technical information as much as practical information about how to properly accommodate people with disabilities, and do so in accordance with state and federal rules and laws. So a couple housekeeping items to start with. First is that your registration does include parts 1 and 2. So we've got today and we've got tomorrow. Tomorrow's is not a repeat of today's. These are different presentations, different types of questions, different information that'll be provided. So I'd really encourage you to make time for both presentations. The materials for this presentation will be available on the website, michigan.gov/ADA30. You can see that on the slide there. So all the presentation materials will be available there, but also follow-up resources will be posted on the session page as well following this presentation. The chat box will remain closed until we get to the live Q&A portion of the conversation. So we've got a panel. The panel will be taking some questions that we've developed ahead of time. Once we're through those, then we'll open up the chat box for some live questions as well. And also, just for your information, this presentation is available on Zoom and Facebook Live, but not YouTube Live today, but it will be posted on YouTube following the presentation. So it could be viewed there just after the fact. During the live Q&A portion, so this just give you a heads up about what's going to happen in the future once we get through the panel discussion. During that live Q&A portion, registered participants may submit questions, either written questions, in other words, just type it into the chat box, and I and others will be monitoring that to ask those of the panelists. And or if you're using the internet audio or the phone option, you click the raise hand in the audio, or press *9 if using the phone to ask questions. We always have to have the disclaimer on there that anybody who's inappropriate or threatening, we do have the ability to mute you. So keep that in mind. I'm sure that won't be a problem. And also, Zoom does offer information regarding accessibility features for their platform. Rather than go over all of those now, we just provided the link there because it kind of depends on what type of device you're accessing Zoom through. So if you'd like to explore those accessibility options, there's the link for you as well, zoom.us/accessibility, or the 800 number is there as well. Okay, so that's it for housekeeping. Now I'm going to introduce the panel. And we've got an outstanding panel of experts today who are going to provide the insight, take some questions, and we really couldn't ask for a better team of people to do so with. So first up is Lolita Davis, who's the Outreach and Training Coordinator for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And Lolita, if you want to say hello.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us. Next is Kim Woolridge, who is the Director of the State ADA Compliance Division in the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Kim.
Hello, thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Welcome, Kim. Thank you for joining us. And next is Jenny Pyatt, the Bureau Division Director in the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity.
Hi, good morning, Brian. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Good morning, Jenny. Next up, Bill Robinson, the Director of the Bureau of Services for Blind Persons.
Good morning, Brian. Appreciate it. And so glad to be here and honored to be on this panel. Thank you.
Great to see you, Bill. And you know, now I feel bad I didn't wear a tie today. You look sharp. Okay, Annie Uraski, from the Director of the Division on Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing. Oh, Toy, you're on mute there.
Hello.
Gotcha, Toy.
This is Annie speaking. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here today.
Very good. Thank you so much. All right. Well, we're going to get right into the questions. We've got a ton of information out there, and so actually, I was going to ask if I could have each of those panelists go ahead and turn your camera back on so that I can see you when you're ready to answer questions, and just give me a visual raise of hand when you're if it's something that you'd like to address. Okay, question number one: as government stay-at-home orders and other restrictions are modified or lifted, how will employers know what steps they can take consistent with the ADA and other disability civil rights laws to screen employees for COVID-19? So we're talking about screening employees here. And who wants to take this first question? All right, Lolita.
Good morning, everyone. This is Lolita. So the ADA does permit employers to make disability-related inquiries and conduct those medical exams as long as it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. And then also as long as it's consistent with recommendations from the CDC and the state and local public health authorities. Some employees may be able to request some of those alternative methods of screening based on, excuse me, disability or religion. Excuse me. So then some of the, I am so sorry. Examples of employers' worksite screening because of the COVID that the ADA does allow is they can ask questions about COVID-19 as far as with the testing. They can ask questions about symptoms, questions about exposure to anyone with COVID, but under the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, would be a violation if they start questioning them about family members. They can take temperatures, as we all know and have heard. They can ask questions if a person calls in or feels sick. And then they can also administer the COVID viral test, but not the antibody test. And then they also, they can instruct employees to stay at home if they have any symptoms or if they have COVID-19.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Lolita. Any other panelists like to take a crack at that question? Okay. Kim.
Not so much to answer it, but I'm not sure if Lolita mentioned this, but EEOC.gov has a great guide for employers to review that information.
Yes, thank you, Kim. It is out there. This is Lolita. It's out there on the website, what you should know, and it answers all questions. And headquarters do update that list too. So it'll address any questions that employers or employees have when it comes to COVID-19. And then even look into it if it'll define and discuss even what's the direct threat too. So that is a great resource to have.
All right, excellent. And Jenny.
It's more kind of piggyback off Lolita. Such a great wealth of information here, having Lolita at the table from EEOC. Lolita, you just mentioned about direct threat. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know with the pandemic, that really, in terms of it satisfying the definition of direct threat, this pandemic 19 really fits into that, correct?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. So at this time, if an employee physically is entering the workplace, under the ADA, it allows the employer to screen for and exclude those with COVID-19 or symptoms because of a direct threat, because it poses a threat to the health and safety of others in the office. And so, but however, the ADA does not allow employers to exclude employees without those COVID-19 symptoms because of a disability, because they may be diabetic, a heart condition, or respiratory issues. So the employer will have to analyze and show that the employee poses a direct threat instead of just making an assumption and excluding the person from the workplace.
Okay, and I think I saw Bill with his hand up next.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to piggyback on that last comment that Lolita made in that some individuals with disability may have trouble breathing, so they may have a normal shortness of breath or other symptoms like a muscle fatigue or muscle pain. And some of these same symptoms associated with normal disability may also overlap with the symptoms of COVID. So again, when you're asking those screening questions, if somebody says, yes, do you have shortness of breath? Yes, I do. Just remember that you may want to follow that up and say, is that a normal condition or is this something new?
That's great insight, Bill, because there is it's one of the issues is that there's obviously multiple potential reasons that a person might have shortness of breath. And so the symptoms aren't, of course, exclusive to COVID-19. Lolita.
And I agree. Thanks, Bill, for that, because I am a person with respiratory issues and I have breathing difficulties quite often. And so if an employer assumes that I have, COVID-19 symptoms of COVID-19, and they just make an assumption that it's a direct threat for me to be in the facility, then that would be a violation of the law. I mean, because that's normal for me,
Kim.
I just wanted to mention also that Michigan has its own disability law that pretty much mirrors the ADA, the Michigan Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act. And this covers employers with one or more employees, where ADA covers employers with 15 or more employees. So there is also state protection with regards to disability issues under the Michigan Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act, which the Michigan Department of Civil Rights enforces and takes complaints on. And we also take complaints for EEOC, as we are a partner with EEOC. Cool. Yep. Thank you.
Excellent. So really, if we could maybe just break this down to as a real direct answer to question number one. Yes, you can screen people, even when they have disabilities. You can ask questions, and really, I guess it sounds like a lot of common sense. I think sometimes people are afraid that they're not allowed. Employers may be afraid they're not allowed to ask questions, or what if they ask the wrong questions? And but really, getting more information, understanding, and especially having a real direct answer that having COVID-19 is a direct threat to others in the workplace, and that is a reason that a person there would be an expectation that person would not be allowed into the workplace to present that direct threat, whether they have a disability or not. Lolita.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say this because a lot of times the employers will focus on the disability, but don't focus on the disability. Talk about why it's a direct threat, because you're impacting the safety of others and not so much the disability. COVID-19, you don't want to go through the screening process. It's a direct threat to the organization.
Excellent. Excellent point. Thank you, Lolita. Let's go ahead and on to question number two now. So we start out with screening, of course, a natural place to start with respect to employees. Now, the next question is, what does an employer need to do when an employee requests a reasonable accommodation? For example, because the employee has one of the medical conditions the CDC says may put them at higher risk for severe illness from COVID-19. And if I could go ahead and even just anticipate an extra question that sometimes employers would have is what if they don't even know that an employee has a disability? That there might not even be that knowledge. So I know sometimes employers are afraid of really understanding when a disability is present, or when a medical condition that would require an accommodation to be made is present. So who would like to take this in terms of what an employer needs to do when an accommodation is requested because of one of the medical conditions the CDC says might put them at higher risk? Start with Kim.
Hi. So the employer, even if the employer knows, the employer cannot ask or cannot try to make an employee take an accommodation. The employee must ask for a reasonable accommodation. And once the employee requests a reasonable accommodation from the employer, that puts the employer on notice that they may have a duty to provide a reasonable accommodation to this employee. So we can kind of break it down a little bit. What is reasonable? What is a reasonable accommodation? Reasonable accommodation is a modification or a change in it could be you getting equipment. It could be a change in how they actually do the job or how they actually apply for a job. It could be a number of things. Reasonable accommodation is unique to each person with a disability. So that'll take me into the interactive process, which you have to engage in what's called the interactive process with an employee when they request a reasonable accommodation. And the interactive process is a big word, or two big words that mean have a conversation with the person, have a discussion with the person. It is the employer and the person talking about what would be an effective and reasonable accommodation for that person so that they can continue to do their job. Sometimes it could be something really simple. Other times it may be something more complicated, and the employer should always check back periodically to make sure the reasonable accommodation is still working.
So it's pretty, well, let's go to Jenny next.
Oh, no, that's, Kim, thank you, spot on. That interactive process, as you said, it's a dialogue, between the employee and the supervisor. And I think also just to add on to that too, is the importance of also documenting the process so that all parties are clear in terms of next steps or what was discussed, on both sides of the house, if you will. And those, as you said, Kim, so true. It's very individualized. It's based on that person and that condition and the essential functions of their job, and whether or not, kind of helping determine what's considered essential, what's considered marginal. Can that be part of the reasonable accommodation? I think about, for example, just like my own hair salon, where I go to, and one of the owner's employees has a disability, and she was very concerned about just that whole transition back, when the phase opened to allow them to do that. And when the accommodations were put in, as far as some of the, if you will, kind of the clear plastic barriers and ways to protect her, it actually benefited all the employees. And what she found is she did that for actually every employee. So what we find a lot of times is the accommodations that apply to one individual often become mainstreamed for all individuals and almost become like a universal design concept, and really help, the Joe public, if you will.
Yeah, it really is interesting to and inspiring to see how often that an employee with a disability who asks for and receives an accommodation, how often it benefits all of the employees that work in that same type of space. Annie.
Hi, this is Annie Uraski speaking. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Kim and Jenny said a little bit, specifically when we're talking about that interactive process. It's critical that employees understand that they can't make an assumption. And that's typically, I think, commonly what happens. So I wanted to stress, like for myself individually as a person with a disability, that interactive process is one of the most important pieces to that puzzle. When you are sitting down and having that conversation with an employer, talking about what accommodations look like, it's not always a one-size-fits-all approach. So it's easy to make an assumption that, as an employer, what works for me will work for everybody else. It'll work for all my employees, but that's not always the case. And right now, with this high stress COVID-19 pandemic environment, of course, we have to figure out on a case-by-case basis. And now it feels like that interactive process has become even more important. And it's more important now because we want to make sure both the employee and the employer are on the same page. When an employee makes the request for a reasonable accommodation, during that interactive process, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to engage in that conversation and figure out what works best. Because the last thing, like as a person with a disability, The last thing I want is the employer to make an assumption about what's going to work for me. We want to make sure that we're both on the same page, and I think that's a very important piece to this. So ask those questions, have that dialogue. And it's become, like I said, even more important right now with everything that's going on.
Excellent points. And for all, I know we have a lot of employers that are watching, and you know, I just want to stress that over and over here, you're hearing that it is okay to have the conversation. You might be surprised how many people are so afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing or they're not. But if you don't have the conversation, how will you know? And many times, the feedback I hear from employers is that the accommodation, once you talk about it, the accommodation is often much simpler than what the employer imagined in the first place. And so it's really, really worth it to have that conversation if the employee requests an accommodation. Okay, I think Lolita had her hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to say also, during this pandemic, the person may not have a disability. And so it could be a fear factor about coming into the workplace. And based on the CDC, it gives you guidance about just the employer being more flexible, some flexibility in what, if a person can work from home. So, you know, with this whole pandemic, we know that in the future, it's going to be hard for employers to say, no, you can't telework as a reasonable accommodation, because that is something that we have been doing since March. So employers are going to have to look at that more and be able to determine, like, is this an undue hardship? How are you going to be able to say it's an undue hardship? And then the ADA does not require an accommodation of an employee for an association with an individual with a disability either. And I just wanted to put that out there, especially with that telework. That telework issue is going to probably, you know, be a big issue for some employers moving forward. But if it is a position that they cannot telework and it is an undue hardship, again, just focus on what is the undue hardship, document it, engage in that interactive process, and explain to the person why they can't, why you can't accommodate them.
So the undue hardship would be the hardship on the employer to provide the accommodation that's being requested.
Yes.
Okay, Kim.
I wanted to kind of follow up on a couple of things that were mentioned. Lolita mentioned some people may not have disabilities prior to COVID-19. But I wanted to also mention that people oftentimes forget hidden disabilities. So don't assume just because you cannot ostensibly tell someone has a disability that they don't have a disability. I wanted to stress, and I mentioned it earlier, that an employer has a duty to provide a reasonable accommodation to an employee under the ADA and or Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act. And I was going to go back to the undue hardship discussion that Lolita was just having. Under the Michigan Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act, MCL, Michigan Compiled Laws 37.1210, Article 2 of the Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act, it provides for what an undue hardship is. It literally has a formula that can be used by an employer to determine whether or not it would be an undue hardship. It's like broken down by how many employees there are. And cautionary, employers like State of Michigan, Ford Motor Company, you can't just look at the department, like an employee who needs an accommodation in the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. The Michigan Department of Civil Rights can't just look at the budget for civil rights. You look at the budget for the state of Michigan. Ford Motor Company, an employee who needs an accommodation for Ford Motor Company won't just look at the Dearborn plant. You look at Ford Motor Company, period. So I just wanted to flesh out those details.
Could maybe one of you drill down a little bit deeper into the issue on if a person asks for an accommodation, does the employer have the ability to ask why they're asking for an accommodation or to verify it, Bill?
Yeah, so this is Bill Robinson, and thanks. Lolita and Kim answered a few things that I was going to touch on, but I think you're hitting on something, Brian, that's very important, and that is when an employee, maybe as Kim points out, has a hidden disability, or maybe is requesting an accommodation and they've never requested one before, what is the employer supposed to do? And so one of the things that the employer has the right to do is to have that employee document or provide documentation as part of that interactive process to understand what is the medical issue that could be preventing that individual from completing their essential job duties. And this is a particularly challenging issue, and I'll turn it over to some of the other panel members to comment on this, in that right now it's very difficult to get into some medical practitioners. And if there is a requirement for medical documentation and the employee is not able to obtain that, what does the employer do? So I'll turn that back over to the panel.
Well, I'm certainly not qualified to follow up on that, Bill, so I'm going to look to the rest of the panel to maybe provide a little bit more insight. Lolita.
I'll try. I mean, they have the virtual appointments now. You may not physically be able to go in, and the employer could be a little bit more flexible in extending the time frame when you should submit the information outlining why you need this reasonable accommodation. So things are opening up a little bit more now. Again, it's a virtual doctor's appointment, but they do have that flexibility. But I think just being more flexible as an employer, giving the person the additional time to submit it. Now, if you don't submit the information, then the employer has every right to deny the reasonable accommodation.
Okay. Jenny?
Thanks, Brian. Yes, this is Jenny. I think the only thing to add to the conversation is because of this sensitive information you're dealing with, people's medical information, sensitive conversations, that it's just mindful for, for a supervisor, for the employer, the business, just, again, kind of Lolita's point of being flexible, understanding it's, this is a really difficult time. People are very stressed. On both sides in terms of business operations and their employee base, and just identifying, the support. And I think more than anything, employees just want to know that their information is confidential, that it's not going to be shared with, other members, their colleagues or, other supervisors or whatnot. I think it's really important to stress the confidentiality of the information. And then I think businesses or employers, supervisors may find that some people have had informal accommodations, for a long time. And this may kind of bring some of those informal accommodations to the surface, and maybe a really good time to have more of a, a formal process in place for that employee, for the employee's protection as well as for the employer's protection too.
Lolita?
And one thing about, even with the pandemic, the employer cannot share, like if I have COVID-19, they cannot share that information. They can only on a need to know basis, and they should store that information like in a file cabinet. They can let staff know, okay, maybe somebody on the 4th floor tested positive, but they cannot share the person's name. And one thing what Jenny was saying that always come out, all of those accommodations is being provided when the people don't really have a reasonable accommodation, then it comes back. When you try to take it away, it's like, oh, you're retaliating against me. So having a formal policy or practice in place is very important, because it could just come back and, hurt you in the long run, especially if the person does not have a disability and not even qualified under the ADA.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice too. And one really, hopefully all the, especially the small business owners watching will take to heart that operating informally when you're small is kind of how you do a lot of things. And so to the extent that you're going through an accommodation process, having documentation and then protecting that documentation. Now, Kim, I saw you had your hand up, and because you've been so knowledgeable so far on which laws say what, I wonder if you could maybe shed a little bit of light on, in terms of the privacy issues. People throw around the federal law HIPAA all the time. I know just enough to know that usually they're saying it in cases where it doesn't apply to, but what, in terms of the medical privacy and storing that information, what could you maybe give a little bit of some tips or some insights on how that information is protected, and maybe even what law would even require it in the first place?
The law that requires it would be the actual ADA, and yes, you have your privacy protections under the HIPAA, health portability. I can't remember the exact name, but HIPAA law. Health Information Portability and Privacy and Portability Act. I think that's it. But yes, you have your protections under that, and to just break it down into clear and simple terms for employees, who the information is shared with is on a need to know basis. So with that being said, the employee could go to HR, and depending on what reasonable accommodation is needed, it could just stay between the employee and HR. That means that the manager may not necessarily have to know. If they don't, like if it's not on a need to know basis, that the manager will have to provide some kind of, direct manager would have to provide some kind of input, the direct manager does not need to know. And definitely, I know a lot of employers ask, but what about other employees? Other employees will see that this employee is being treated differently or given some different equipment or whatever, and they will ask questions. And again, it's on a need to know basis. And if an employer reveals that to someone who does not need to know, that's a violation of it could be a violation of both the ADA and HIPAA law.
MYOB, mind your own business.
Right.
All right, Lolita.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say too that thanks, Kim, for that information. But if an employee, I don't have to request a reasonable accommodation. It doesn't have to be in writing. I know some employers won't act on that request until you put it in writing. But if it's an obvious disability, then you shouldn't need anything in writing. I don't have to use those magic words that I need a reasonable accommodation. I can just tell you that I have this issue going on and I need, some type of assistance. Like a person with a learning disability, they'll usually request that the instructions be provided in writing. And so it doesn't have to be in writing. Eventually, yes, you will have to put it in writing and submit that information, but to act on it, initially, my request doesn't have to be in writing.
Well, let me do one more follow-up on this question, because there's just so much to unpack with it. Because inherent in the question is this idea of medical conditions, but we're talking about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Could one of you maybe talk about how the scope of things that the ADA covers, which are disabilities and certain medical conditions that aren't necessarily disabilities, or maybe not the way that people think of it? Kim?
So the ADA provides protection for disabilities and Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act. So what is a disability? That's basically what you're saying. So it's a mental or physical impairment that substantially affects one or more life activities. So that means things like things you may not even think about. It's the obvious things like if a person is blind, or if a person is deaf, or if a person has some kind of cognitive disability. But it can also be things like hypertension that affects the pulmonary system, I believe, or heart disease that affects I cannot think of the exact, the heart system,
Yeah,
and cardiac system. And it can even be things like diabetes that affects the endocrine system. And if a person is having reproductive issues that affects the reproductive system, it can be a host of things that affects a major life activity. And that's the systems that they affect is the major life activity that it would affect. And it could be conditions that are transitory or episodic, like multiple sclerosis or lupus. So you look at it in its active state, I should say.
All right, very good. And I think it's one of a common misconception is people think that people think about the ADA in terms of disabilities that they can see. Maybe would understand there are some disabilities that they can't see, but to the extent that there are conditions that that they might consider in a different way in a medical context, the place where it falls under the ADA is when it affects the person's like a function, a major life function of that person that is also connected to the job, and that's when an accommodation might be requested. Okay, Lolita.
Yeah, I just want to say this last thing. As far as allergies and fragrance sensitivities, and because of the pandemic, some people may be allergic to the latex, the gloves. And so looking at some form of reasonable accommodation. With respiratory issues, they may not be able to wear the mask because it impacts the breathing. But can you provide them with a shield, one of the face shields, or a different type of mask that would not impact their ability to breathe?
All right, very good. Well, let's move on to question 3 then. What should an employer do if an employee entering the workplace requests an alternative method of screening due to a medical condition? And I'll go ahead and anticipate kind of a follow-up if one of you want to address, or maybe just some, what would be an example of an alternative screening that might be available? And another one that has come up quite often is, there's an expectation of privacy. When you're doing screening, depending on what type of screening that you're doing, what are the privacy expectations? So let's just get a little bit more into that screening, but it's starting with the alternatives, but also maybe some insight into what might be expected in terms of privacy while being screened. Well, don't all jump at once. Lolita?
You can go ahead with Bill. Bill had his hand.
Oh, sorry, Bill. Yes. Okay.
Hey, this is Bill Robinson again. Yeah, so for an alternative screening in the case of somebody with blindness, they may need, if there's for instance, some companies are going to an electronic screening that the employee completes online prior to coming to the workplace. And if that electronic version is a PDF that isn't accessible online, or maybe it's a system that's not accessible in general to a screen reading software, that may be something that would require some kind of alternative method. So If the employer can't provide that immediately, you may have an employer that needs to call that employee up and go through those questions prior to entering the workplace, whereas other employees might be doing it electronically.
Okay. Anybody else have anything more to add to the screening question? Kim?
So this is something I think Annie may can touch on more, but if you have an employee who is deaf and reads lips, you may require the person who's doing the screening, like if you have a live screening, a person who's doing the screening live at the front door or what have you, and they're asking questions, if they read lips, you may have an employee who requests that the employer provide masks with the clear opening. It's plastic, but it's still covered, but it's clear, so that the person can read lips. And that would be a one form of accommodation during the screening.
Okay. Annie?
This is Annie speaking. Yeah, I was actually planning on mentioning that, Kim. It's a very important topic. If you have someone who's deaf and uses sign language, English might not be their first language. So for example, if the employer has a written form that needs to be filled out, for some deaf people, they might need to ask for translation services, or they might need to phone in and do the screening process over the phone rather than having that form filled out in person. So it might, they might need that form into another language if that isn't their first language, just like anybody else who uses another language. And for screening for a deaf and hard of hearing person, I can tell you right now that there's many people in the deaf, blind, and hard of hearing community that have additional barriers that they're facing because those regular face masks that you see cover so much of the face, and you lose the facial expressions, the body language. And really those are one of the most important parts of our language to help us understand and interact with the people and the world. So from the employer perspective, of course you want to think about safety. That's top of mind. You want to have masks. You want to make sure that those protocols are being followed, but you also have to be able to understand that the deaf person needs to either be able to read lips or see facial expressions and body language. And so those clear masks are an option, or the clear face shields, so you can see each other through that during the screening process. And I think that's an important part of the process too. That's an important thing to consider. Often when we're talking about that screening process, we tend to think of, oh, this is good enough. But we don't think about the impact that good enough has. We don't think about the impact of wearing masks and what that has, that increased level of stress and frustration that it adds to our community. So I think it's important to stress that, yes, we have to be willing to be flexible, 100%, especially with accommodations. Thank you.
Yeah, I have noticed the clear face masks. You got the shields, but then also there's masks that are clear. And I do have some confidence that that innovators out there in the marketplace are going to come up with better ideas now that they're uncomfortable. Nobody likes it, and so hopefully better and better ideas will come out, and those ideas will have universal design as part of in mind when they're developed in the first place. Jenny.
I think I just wanted to add, Brian, all great comments and potential solutions for an individual. I think too, it's good to just kind of step back and just ask the employee, what do you think might be beneficial in this circumstance when looking at the screening process? So I wouldn't be fearful or cautious just to ask the employee, what are your thoughts? Get their ideas and get their input in the process, because again, it's not a one size fits all, when it comes to reasonable accommodations, or particularly in these current circumstances.
Lolita.
And it may be the change could be easy, like what Jenny was saying about her hairstylist, and they got shield, the protectors for everyone. So if it's inexpensive, then the employer may go ahead and get it anyway. So you want to just at least request to see, you know, because they may be able to provide it and it may not cause any type of undue hardship. They just voluntarily said, oh, it's inexpensive, we'll go ahead and get it.
Seems like a good time to bring up that the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity has workplace safety grants that you can use to get some of this some of the PPE that could accomplish some of this. All right, well, let's move on to question number 4. An employer knows their employee has a condition that the CDC has identified as putting the employee at higher risk for severe illness. The employer is concerned that the employee's health will be jeopardized upon returning to the workplace, but the employee has not requested an accommodation. Probably more common than what you might think. I think it's probably more common than an employee asking for an accommodation. How does the ADA or disability civil rights laws apply to this type of a situation? Lolita.
Well, first, it won't, if the employee does not request that reasonable accommodation, the ADA does not mandate that the employer takes action. And then they can't exclude, the employer can't exclude the person from the workplace or take any adverse action against them because the employee has a disability that the CDC identifies as potentially, you know, placing them at a higher risk. So they, again, and you're looking at the direct threat theory, they have to come and to say, why would this be a direct threat? Is it impacting the safety? But the first thing is the person did not request the reasonable accommodation, so they wouldn't be protected under the ADA.
If I could maybe a follow-up to that question, to get back into the concept of direct threat, because this is something that most employers would not have any experience with and wouldn't know about anything about except for what they're learning today. So when we talk about direct threat, we're talking about presented by the employee to the other employees in the workplace. But so that wouldn't apply to an employer saying, yeah, but I think that the workplace is a direct threat to this particular employee, and therefore I don't think the employee should be there. So that would not be allowed. That type of absent the employee asking for an accommodation, it's not the employer's responsibility to be worried on behalf of the employee. The employee would need to bring the concern to the employer. Is that correct, Kim?
Generally, in the situation of COVID-19, that is true. In other situations that may involve mental health, that is not necessarily true.
Okay, well, expand on that a little bit.
So if an employer is concerned that an employee is exhibiting behavior or there's something that an employee is doing that could be a harm to themselves and others. I can think of a couple of things off the top of my head, but just making threats, wielding weapons, something like that. They absolutely have the right to make inquiries or take action to protect that employee and other employees. But an employer, but with regards to COVID-19, no, because an employee may be coughing, that's not necessarily that you're protecting that employee. That could possibly be a direct threat to other employees. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so in this case, since I know really what brought about this conversation is mainly COVID-19, and so it's good to have the wider context too, but in the sense that if an employer, maybe they provided an accommodation before, so they happen to know, the employer happens to know that the employee has a medical condition that the CDC says puts them at higher risk, the employer wouldn't have an obligation or really shouldn't go to that employee proactively and say, hey, we need to do something to protect you more. The employee needs to be the one who brings up the ask or the request.
Absolutely.
Lolita.
And thanks, Kim, but what she's talking about, like if under the ADA, I don't have to request a reasonable accommodation. I don't have to tell you I have a disability, but if you have a mental impairment and you're, threatening people, the employer, again, should not be focusing on the mental illness. They should be focusing on that you violated the company policy. With this pandemic, if you are you didn't request a reasonable accommodation, but you're in the workplace and you're coughing and you have a fever and all of these things going on, then is the employer going to look at that as that's a direct threat to the safety, of other employees? So it's not a reasonable accommodation case, but if you're looking at it, that's a direct threat because it can impact everyone else in the office where they can get COVID-19. So just conversation, interactive process, just communication is so key, and especially right now during this pandemic.
Okay, Jenny.
I was just going to add it. That seems to kind of fit in line. Lolita, please feel free to comment on that concept of fit for duty and when an employer can request that fit for duty, correct?
Yes. And that is something that they can do, the fitness for duty, to determine, is this a direct threat? They're not making an assumption, right? It's based on, this is what I see that's going on. These are the symptoms, and you can send them for that fitness for duty exam, Because the goal is to protect the people in the workplace, the safety of it. I think sometimes a lot of employers still get caught up in the disability and not focusing on the threat, like how is this impacting the safety of your office.
Okay, and Jenny, were you maybe going to touch on what is the fitness for duty? What would get into that a little bit more?
Well, I think the concept there is that, it goes back to that interactive and that dialogue, and I think just backing up just a little bit to Lolita and Kim's point, it's again asking the employer, frontline manager, HR, whomever that might be, is having that conversation, doing a check-in, like, how are you feeling? Or I notice, there's some things going on that maybe is not some of their part of their normal, health when they've come in. So it's okay to do that check-in with staff. We all do that currently. That fitness for duty is really part of that protection for both the employee and the employer. So if there are symptoms that are being exhibited, or Kim mentioned about the mental health, and when there's maybe erratic behavior or behavior that's threatening to other employees, to themselves, the employer has a right for fitness for duty before bringing that employee back to work. They do have a right to that. Did I miss anything, Kim? Lolita, jump in.
Let's go to Kim next.
I was just going to mention that a lot of times employers have difficulty finding the words to do this. And it's kind of all what we've been saying. How are you doing? Is there anything I can do to help you do your job better? Just those questions that you ask regularly, not at all, do you have a disability, anything like that, but how are you doing? Is there something I can do to help you do your job better or make it through these times better? Things like that.
Okay, Lolita.
Kim, she addressed it, but it's just under this, for you just remember you can't exclude a person from the workplace or subject them to any adverse employment action. And looking at the accommodation of telework, if it's a person that has those symptoms, can you allow them to telework? Telework is going to be so important moving forward. The new normal, so employers just need to look at that more as a reasonable accommodation.
Jenny.
And just last comment, Brian, about the fitness for duty. It's a term we hear, but what does that really mean? And for folks who are listening in, it's understanding that that's like a medical exam that's getting documentation, from a treating physician or an independent medical evaluation to help make that determination for fitness, for what's considered fitness for duty.
All right, well, why don't we get into to question number 5, which is, what are examples of accommodations that, absent undue hardship, may eliminate or reduce to an acceptable level a direct threat to self? Lolita.
So outside of those accommodations for the gloves, the shields, sometimes employers can remove some of those marginal duties from a person's responsibilities, not eliminating the essential functions of the job, but some marginal duties, like if it's a secretary normally in the office, they're answering the phones, they may set up a conference room for training, get coffee, do these things, or sometimes do mail. That doing the mail and putting coffee and stuff out may not be an essential function. It could be a marginal duty. So removing some of those marginal duties could be a form of a reasonable accommodation.
Thank you. Bill?
Yes, thank you, Brian. This is Bill. Just in terms of thinking creatively is very important. And again, going back to something Jenny said earlier, talking to the employee. For example, if you are a owner of a retail store, and let's say the individual cannot tolerate a mask, but your normal stocking hours typically start while customers are in the store, maybe there's a way to shift that stocking job to an hour when customers aren't in the store and social distance that person away from other employees by isolating them. So there's a lot of creative ways to think about this. And then I would like to mention, when employees do go to telework, it's also important to make sure that if they have disclosed a visual impairment or blindness, then you're working with them to make sure any platforms for conferencing are available from an accessibility standpoint. As I understand it, Zoom is an excellent platform for that. And also that when you're actually showing documents online and you have someone with a visual impairment, you're describing or sending those documents out ahead of time so they can fully participate. So thank you.
Great. And now I'll go to Annie next, and I see Kim has your hand up too, but we're running out of time for these questions. So how about Annie will ask this, and then we'll go on to question number 6, and then I'll go to you, Kim, and just in case you want to follow up on 5 and anticipate that you have an outstanding answer to question 6 before you even see it. Okay, Annie.
This is Annie speaking. Thank you. I just wanted to stress one important thing. We are aware that right now employers they're stressed trying to figure out how to even evaluate and what to do during this time of pandemic. But it's important that the employees and the employers both are creative in trying to figure out the strategies. For an example, as a deaf person or even a deaf-blind person, the concept of face shields and masks, it's not just going to benefit me, the deaf or hard of hearing person, but it's also a benefit to their coworkers, to people who are trying to communicate in the workplace with those individuals. And so I think it's really important that we stress the creativity piece. It's not just for the employee with a disability, it actually benefits everyone in the workplace. Also, I wanted to add, to Bill's point about teleworking. Technology is has had a huge impact on the deaf, blind, and hard of hearing community. We rely so much on the visual piece, that language information, and so employees who are working from home, they can still access, the staff meetings, all the different meetings that are happening via phone, but they need to be willing to provide an interpreter on video. So you still can be creative in finding ways to be inclusive of those individuals with disabilities, whether they're deaf, blind, or hard of hearing, but though there are options, you just have to be creative and be willing to interact and interact with that employee to find out those resources. You know, there's a way to really navigate this stressful time for everyone, but it's important that we work together. And if we work together, we can find those solutions.
Excellent. Lolita?
Yeah, and I wanted to just say one thing to Annie. I know that we're in this new world with technology and Zoom, and the closed caption feature needs a lot of work because you can barely see it. So having an interpreter for the employers out there, maybe having an interpreter would be your best bet, unless you have it on the screen where that closed caption is really visible for a person to see it, or again, providing them the documentation beforehand with big print, large print.
Okay. All right, now question 7, or 6 and 7, we're actually this will be kind of a lightning round here because I want to get to our participants as well and questions that they have. As a best practice and in advance of having some or all employees return to the workplace, are there ways for an employer to invite employees to request flexibility in work arrangements? So I think this really gets to that question about, you know, you're supposed to wait for an accommodation to be requested. But I think kind of inherent in this question is just something you're offering to all employees, so you're treating everybody the same. And so in that extent, I wouldn't imagine there would be a problem with making an offer such as that, as long as you're treating everybody the same. Lolita?
And what's going on with us with the EEOC, they established a email address, a portal, they send out information, so communication is key. And because they're trying to return people back to the workforce, it's important to reach out because some people are not comfortable with returning back to the office. So here is the point of contact. If you need a reasonable accommodation, you know, I can contact my supervisor to let them know during this pandemic that what my fears are, what my medical condition is, and so that they can, you know, some of them best practices, and we can have that conversation because it makes us feel comfortable. You invite the employee to request some type of flexibility, and on the employer's part, being flexible, you know, during this time, because this is a difficult time. It's a difficult time. So communication is always key, putting the message out there. What does your company tend to do? What about cleaning the facility? You know, is that a thorough cleaning? Define, what does that mean? Are you just gonna wipe down the common areas? Are you gonna clean the carpet? Are you gonna spray? One of the things that we've done is if we go back, that the break room is closed, you know, putting a message, no breaks. The break room will be closed because that's where people will not probably practice social distancing, right? So just communicating your expectations when you invite the employees to return back to the workplace.
Okay. Any others for this one before we move on to the final question? All right, the final is, are employers allowed to disclose medical details such as known high-risk conditions or other personal information about an employee that displays symptoms such as a high fever or who has tested positive for COVID-19? I imagine the answer to this question is no. Lolita?
And we touched on this earlier, no. You can say somebody on the 4th floor, you know, tested positive, but you cannot disclose any medical details about an employee or their medical condition. It's a no, you can't. It'll be a violation of the ADA.
And this is, you know, this is probably hard. It's going to take discipline, you know, like this question up here, people probably read and say, of course not. But when you have knowledge that an employee tested positive for COVID-19, and it's the biggest news across the whole globe right now, and so people are gonna, the pressure of other employees, well, somebody here is tested positive, and who is it, and trying to find out. And maybe employers ought to think ahead about being prepared for the pressure of people trying to figure out who, and make sure that they're not violating people's privacy, because it is definitely a clear no. Kim.
Just before we go on, I wanted to provide one resource to employers, especially small businesses, for accommodating or looking for accommodations for employees. AskJan.org. www.askjan.org. That is the Job Accommodation Network. And they have on their website a list of proposed accommodations, and you can talk to someone live. I'm not sure right now during COVID-19, but previously you could talk to someone live, and they can help you work through an accommodation for your employees for free.
Great. AskJan.org. Jenny.
I would just add, piggyback off Kim, as well as Lolita, think too of some of your internal resources within. I know some companies that might be on, you have employee resource groups or ERGs that are specific to disability. Those are great resources as far as the communication piece, or your assistance employee, your EAPs, your assistance employee, programs, for your employees. Some other resources, Jan's a great start, because that starts allowing you to do a little digging and having that interactive dialogue with the employee, and giving the employee some ideas too. Some local resources too include the state vocational rehab agencies as well. Bill Robinson with Bureau Services for Blind program, his agency, our agency, Michigan Rehab Services. We do have some technical staff who understand assistive technology and what kind of accommodations might be appropriate in the workplace based on essential functions. So a lot of times we partner with Kim, with Lolita, and kind of talk through some of those accommodations in addition to Jan, and utilizing them as a resource.
Okay, and Lolita.
And the EEOC.gov has all types of resources out there, and the what you should know will help. We have an outreach and education person basically in all states, So even if as an employer or small business owner, there's information on the website for small business owners. But if you just want to talk to someone, you can reach out and contact the outreach and education coordinators, and whatever questions or concerns you may have, talk it out with them, and they will provide you with what your next step should be. And that's the relationship that I've established with Jenny and MRS. They'll contact me. So that's part of our jobs, is to educate employers on the laws and employees to make sure they understand what their rights and responsibilities are. And they do have a list of all the outreach and education coordinators on a nationwide basis on the website, where you can contact the local EEOC office in your area.
All right, excellent, great resources. And remember, we'll have resources up on the resource page that we'll get back to in a few minutes as a follow-up to this presentation. So now the chat box is being opened up for your questions. So anybody who has a question, please do just type it into the chat box, and we'll take a look and bring it up for the panelists to discuss. Remember, if you're on the phone or using the audio option, there's the raise hand function, or press *9. And if you need information about the accommodation options that Zoom offers, it's zoom.us/accessibility. And the toll-free number is there on the screen as well. I think if we move to the next slide. And so let me go ahead and get to take a look at these questions here. And there are several coming in. Let's see here. Kim and Jenny mentioned about the dialogue between the employer and employee in maintaining documentation. Can that documentation include dialogue that was gathered using speech or text technology? I suppose this question is regarding, oh, and now there's somebody coming in that I lost the question. Let's see here.
Brian, this is Kelly, the moderator. I have the question for you. It's Bill Robinson mentioned that during the screening process, individuals may have COVID-19 symptoms that may be symptoms of an individual's normal medical condition. As a person that has multiple disabilities myself, what would you suggest to individuals who want to be truthful but don't want to divulge hidden disability, health-related information to their employer?
So who'd like to take that one? Bill.
Yeah, so I'll go back to this, Bill talking again. I'll go back to kind of what I said before, and I think employers can be creative in the questions in terms of just yes or no. It could be something to the effect of, is this a new condition? If someone says, yes, I do have muscle aches, which is actually now a symptom, or I do have digestive issues, which is also listed as a new symptom, or I do have trouble breathing. You know, if those questions are answered yes, and the employer just automatically assumes that that's a COVID issue, I think it's probably incumbent, at least on the employer side, to have the ability in either an electronic screening question or verbal screening live to be able to ask the follow-up to say, is this something new? Or and then all the employee has to say is, no, it's not something new. And they don't have to go into more details than that, than to say, answer in that way. They don't have to say, well, no, this is something not new because blah, 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 I've had this medical or issue for 20 years and I've never disclosed it for it. It's just a simple, no, it's not new, and then the employer can score that accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Kim and Jenny mentioned about the dialogue between the employer and employee in maintaining documentation. Can that documentation include dialogue that was gathered using speech to technology? I suppose this questions the legality of using the technology when somebody needs it. Jenny?
Hi, thanks, Bill. Thank you, Brian. This is Jen. If that's some means of communication, and I'll certainly, Kim, jump in, Lolita, and Annie too, but if that's a primary means of communication for someone, then absolutely that can be inclusive of the dialogue that you're capturing and documenting along the way.
All right, and Kim has something to offer?
So I can't speak specifically to the right of privacy to such technology, but I am aware that in recording conversations, if you're in Michigan, if you are a part of the conversation, it is legal for you to record that conversation. So that's all I have to offer for that.
Okay, and Annie, did you have something also?
Yes, this is Annie speaking. I wanted to just add, just sort of touch on what Jenny mentioned. If that's your primary mode of communication, I mean, if that's what works for you, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
So this next, there was a compliment, by the way, for, it says, what are you using for captioning? They are superb. So some good feedback there. Can an employer require an employee to have a COVID test If an employee does tell you he or she had a COVID test, can you require the employee to provide the results? Lolita.
The employer can do like the swab, or they can do the test. And they do need to know if you tested positive or negative for COVID-19.
Okay, so an employer can, actually, there's an executive.
Not the antibody test, but they can do just the regular COVID test.
All right. And can you give more details on where the material is on the website, the virtual events section, but can't find it anywhere? I wonder, is the material up yet, or is that to be loaded later? I think our technology people would need to probably speak up for that one. Annie?
Yeah, this is Annie speaking. All of the information with this session will be posted on the website. And the address is www.michigan.gov/ADA30.
Okay. What are some examples of undue hardships if an employee asks for telecommuting as an accommodation when employees go back to work? Lolita?
So one of the biggest undue hardships that some employers come up as a defense is your job. You can't telework. You know, your job doesn't require you to telework. So they won't grant that, or they'll come up with, so like if you, right now, the people that work in the grocery stores and things, they have to work. They can't work from home. So basically they have to just justify why you can't telework. Even though everything is closed down, if you're in a position where you're essential to the workplace, but if your job doesn't allow you to telework, then you can't telework.
Okay. And how about cost? There was another question on costs. Is it the responsibility of the employer to furnish home offices, furniture, equipment, technology? Lolita?
We just had this happen. Is that a request for a reasonable accommodation? Do you have some type of disability where you need a chair? What our director did, she met the people on the side of the building. If they wanted to get their chairs, she did take them down there for them. So is it a reasonable accommodation that you need while you are working at home? It's still an issue about the cost of, you know, our phone bills are going up, our computer usage is going up. That's still up in the air. But if it's some type of chair or office equipment, then you should be able to request that as a reasonable accommodation. Or if you don't have a disability, again, that employer being kind of flexible and voluntarily saying, okay, let's do this. It doesn't cost much. Like we had concerns with, because of the position of the computers now, we're at home, our wrists are just laying down, you know, and if you have like some issues with your wrist, we ordered some of those mouse pads where they can rest it on there, and we just ordered those for everybody on my team instead of just giving it to one person. So it just depends on the cost of it. They can do it, or if it's do it as a reasonable accommodation.
Bill?
Yes, and I want to, this is Bill speaking, I want to comment on that. Jenny and I had a fun conversation because we were talking about our own workspace, and we both had terrible chairs, and I was like, well, this is only going to last for 4 weeks. And then it was like, well, just 2 more weeks. And then it was finally like, okay, I need to do something. So the ADA, if you look back at the congressional record, it talks about who, you know, kind of what is meant by undue hardship, and really what Congress intends on that is that for someone who qualifies under the ADA, all resources are looked at. So if they have an open case for vocational rehabilitation, the VR agencies in Michigan can help do an assessment and help with that cost. Also, Congress said to look at the tax credits that are available as well as the deductions. And then going back to the other comment that I think Kim made, you know, if it's an office that's a small outlier in a smaller city, but the company is a large company, you have to consider all the resources of the company, not just the budget for that one that one local office or that one cost center. So it's something that definitely is a consideration that needs to be addressed. And then also Congress says even the employee can buy their own if it's considered too much of an undue hardship for the employer. That is certainly a resource as well. But it also talks about if there are other alternatives, and not to just look at the first alternative as too expensive. If there's another alternative available, maybe that can work as well. So again, it goes back to a little bit about creativity and looking at all the resources out there that are available, including the grant that you mentioned, that's Brian earlier.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you for that. And then Jenny, do you have one more thing to offer?
I would thank you, Brian. I was just going to add to Bill in terms of the creativity. As you said, sometimes it's really inexpensive. Looking at like a sit-stand option, because I'm sure for folks who might be on the line who are doing a lot of telework, your meetings probably just increase 3 times fold in terms of Zoom meetings or team meetings. I started using my ironing board as a sit-stand option with my laptop, just so I wasn't sitting all the time. So sometimes, as Bill was saying, there's some really creative options out there. And again, just accessing your resources, like Jan or BSBP, MRS, and the other, with EEOC and MDCR, there's really some really cool options there. Just need to talk it through and ask the employee. Definitely ask the employee.
Brian, this is Kelly. We do have someone with a raised hand. I'm going to go ahead and allow them to speak. They will have to unmute themselves.
Okay.
And the individual is Mark Sanford Pelcher. So Mark, if you have your question, if you can unmute yourself at this time.
I pushed the button by mistake.
Hey, Mark,
Okay.
can I hear you? Oh, okay. All right. So, all right, no problem. All right, very good. Well, I think that actually is because we're coming up on our time, and I have a few thank yous I want to make sure that I say as we move on here. First of all, thanks to the All-Star panelists who have provided this expertise. I want to remind you that that we do have part 2 of this session coming up tomorrow. Thank you to the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, Deputy Director Sean Egan, who's been great on communication, for providing the opening remarks. Also, special thank you to our ASL interpreters, Toy Bogan and April Davison. I've worked with both of them before, and I'm so impressed with how they're able to listen and outwardly communicate at the same time. My brain could not do that. It's very impressive. And then also today's virtual session in captioning was graciously coordinated by the Deaf Professional Arts Network, DPAN, which of course we know from the comment made earlier that they did a superb job. So thank you so much for that. And remember, tomorrow, August 6th, 10 through 11:30 is part 2 of this session. And you'll use the same exact link to join. So there will not be a new link sent to you. If you registered, use the same link tomorrow. And I think that we are about to wrap up. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you again to all the panelists, and we'll look forward to seeing you same time, same place tomorrow. Bye everybody.